Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The building had a name that nobody used. It was officially registered with the Interspecies Integration Authority as the Callaway Mendez Cooperative Residential Facility, which was the kind of name that got written on forms and then quietly abandoned by everyone who actually had to live inside it. The residents called it the Stack, which was less poetic but more honest, because that was more or less what it was. 6 floors of human maintenance personnel stacked beneath 4 floors of alien diplomatic staff, separated by a reinforced acoustic barrier on the 6th floor ceiling that was supposed to minimize cultural friction and mostly minimize the sound of the upstairs plumbing. Cal Reeves had lived on the 3rd floor for 6 years. He had a narrow bed, a window that looked directly into a ventilation shaft, a kitchen unit the size of a generous thought, and a storage closet he had organized with the focused energy of a man who owned very little and had decided that the little he owned would be immaculate. Emergency rations on the left, pressure suit hanging from the hook on the right. 3 stacked crates of paperback novels along the back wall, because the building's network throttled to approximately the speed of geological thought on the lower floors, and he had made his peace with paper sometime around year 2. His official title was Infrastructure Integration Specialist. The title had been created by the Diplomatic Quarters HR Department during the first interspecies cohabitation review, when someone had decided that the word maintenance sounded insufficiently collaborative in mixed species documentation. Cal had no strong feelings about the title. It appeared on his badge and his tax forms and nowhere else in his life. And in practice, what it meant was that he fixed the things that broke in a building full of people who were too diplomatically significant to be expected to fix things themselves, and that he did this with a thoroughness and a silence that had, over 6 years, made him essentially invisible to everyone above the 4th floor, which he had also made his peace with mostly. The upper 4 floors belonged to the Ithari delegation and associated embassy personnel, and their presence in the building was something Cal understood primarily through infrastructure. He understood it through the secondary ventilation system he'd installed on the 7th floor to accommodate Ithari respiratory preferences, which ran at a slightly higher oxygen saturation than the human standard, and which had required him to recalibrate the entire building's atmospheric management node over a single very long weekend. He understood it through the translation hardware mounted at every corridor junction, small gray boxes that hummed at a frequency just below hearing and occasionally rendered Ithari idiom into human language, with results that were technically accurate and socially bewildering. He had once passed a wall node that translated an overheard conversation as the soup of obligation has grown cold, which he suspected meant something very specific in context and which had stayed with him. He understood it through the shoes he occasionally saw outside apartment 7C, which were small enough to belong to a child, and through the child safety lock he'd been asked to install on that apartment's interior door 6 weeks ago. Standard form, no conversation required. He understood Ambassador Vea Solon primarily through the elevator. They rode it together perhaps twice a week. She was tall by Ithori standards, which put her close to human average, and at a passing glance she could move through the building's lobby without drawing much attention. Dark hair pulled back with the precision of someone who had strong opinions about efficiency, features that were composed in the specific way of a person who had spent decades representing something larger and more complicated than themselves. It was the second glance that changed things. Her eyes held 2 concentric irises, a deep violet outer ring and an inner ring of pale gold that shifted with the light, and along the inside of both forearms ran bioluminescent lines, lineage markings. He'd read somewhere, specific to Ithari family genetics, that in normal circumstances glowed a quiet amber. In the elevator, they mostly stood in the silence of 2 people who occupied the same building and respected each other's right to exist in it, and she said things that the translation node rendered as acknowledged, and he said good morning, and the doors opened, and they went their separate ways, and this had always seemed to him like a perfectly reasonable arrangement. On the morning the chaos began, he was descending from a sixth-floor ventilation check with a replacement capacitor in his left hand and a maintenance form on his tablet in his right, and he stepped out of the stairwell onto the seventh-floor landing to take the shortcut through the east corridor, and found Ambassador Solon standing very still outside apartment 7C. She was holding her communicator in both hands. She was staring at the closed door. The bioluminescent lines on her forearms were burning a bright, unsteady white that he had never seen before, pulsing at a rhythm that had nothing calm in it. She did not look at him. He did not say good morning. He took the long way back to the stairs, descended to his floor, filed his maintenance report, and spent the rest of the morning aware of a quality in the building above him that he could not name but which felt like the particular pressure that precedes a change in weather. By evening, it had a name. The child in apartment 7C was missing, and the diplomatic quarter had begun to move. By the second morning, there were 17 people involved in the search, and Cal had counted all of them, which was not something he had intended to do, but which had happened anyway in the way that certain facts force themselves on a person simply by existing in sufficient number. He had counted them while carrying a junction seal replacement down the fourth-floor corridor, and again while signing the recycler maintenance log in the basement, and once more while eating his lunch at the small table in his quarters where he could hear, through the ceiling, the rhythm of coordinated footsteps moving in patterns that no ordinary residential activity ever produced. 4 security officers from the Ithori consulate, in their gray coats with the embassy seal pressed flat against the left shoulder. 2 human liaisons from the integration office wearing lanyards and the specific expression of people who had been trained to project calm and were discovering the limits of that training. The building manager, whose name was Ferris, and who had in 6 years never once knocked on Cal's door for any reason that wasn't a broken pipe, and who was now apparently a permanent fixture in the 7th-floor common room, visible every time Cal passed the open doorway, standing slightly behind everyone else with the posture of a man hoping the situation would resolve itself without requiring anything further from him personally. And then the others, embassy contacts who arrived in pairs and departed in different pairs, as though the search were conducting a slow and anxious rotation. A woman who came on the second afternoon carrying a handheld atmospheric scanner, a decent model, Cal noted, the kind used for tracing biological residue signatures across shared ventilation systems, and who spent 3 hours pressing it to the building's structural walls with a frown of deepening professional dissatisfaction, because the stack's ventilation was old enough and complicated enough that the residue readings were, as Cal could have told her if asked, essentially meaningless. The building breathed everyone's air through the same 12 ducts. It had done so for 11 years. Any biological trace signature in those walls belonged to everyone and therefore, in practical terms, to no one. Nobody asked Cal. This was not, strictly speaking, surprising. He had spent 6 years perfecting the specific invisibility of maintenance work, which operated on the principle that a building's infrastructure was most successful when it went entirely unnoticed, and that the people responsible for it were most appreciated when they were, by extension, also unnoticed. He had fixed the heating and nobody had thanked him. He had replaced the lobby's translation node firmware at 2 in the morning, and the next day the diplomatic staff had moved through the newly functional corridor without acknowledgement, which was correct and appropriate and fine. He understood the arrangement. What he had not fully considered, until now, was that the invisibility was apparently comprehensive enough to include situations where the invisible person might have relevant information, which seemed like a design flaw in the system that nobody had caught during testing. He noticed things. He had always noticed things. It was, in a technical sense, his job. He had noticed on the first night of the search that his storage closet door was not quite flush with its frame when he came home from a late boiler check. The magnetic seal was intact. He tested it twice, and nothing inside appeared disturbed, and he stood in the doorway for a moment holding his flashlight and not quite pointing it at the gap between the emergency crate and the back wall, and then he decided he was tired. He had been doing 12-hour shifts since the heating system on the 9th floor developed a secondary pressure fault 3 weeks ago, and tired people miscounted things and imagined things and saw imprecision in perfectly precise magnetic seals, and he went to bed. On the second morning, 2 of the vacuum-packed ration bars on the 3rd shelf were gone. He stood with the closet door open and his inventory form in his hand, and he counted the remaining bars with the slow, careful attention of a man who knows what he counted last time, and is sincerely hoping mathematics will behave differently on this occasion. It did not. He recounted. The number did not improve. He looked at the gap behind the crate, which was dark and 60 centimeters wide and very quiet. He listened. The building hummed around him. The ventilation, the recycler, the distant machinery of 11 years of infrastructure doing what infrastructure did. And within that hum, there was nothing audible that could be identified as anything other than building. He put the inventory form away. He told himself he would do a full recount tomorrow. He was aware, in a part of himself, that he was deliberately not consulting, that this was not an inventory problem. He went upstairs. He replaced a pressure valve on the 5th floor and signed the form, and did not look into the 7th floor common room as he passed it, which meant he failed to not look into it, because the not looking required its own form of attention. And what he saw in that involuntary glance was Ambassador Solon standing at the center of the room, with the communicator pressed between both palms, her eyes moving across the map on the portable screen, the bioluminescent lines on her forearms burning at a steady, exhausted white that had none of the acute urgency of the first night and all of something worse, the particular quality of a person who has moved through the sharp stage of fear into the long one. She looked like someone running a calculation that kept returning the same answer and who had decided to keep running it anyway because stopping meant accepting the result. Cal went back downstairs. He ate his sandwich. He listened to the ceiling. He did not sleep particularly well, and in the morning he took his inventory form out of the cabinet, uncapped a pen, and walked to the storage closet with the specific energy of a man who has made a decision he is not going to unmake. He opened the closet door with the measured calm of a man who had decided that whatever was on the other side of it, he was going to handle it at a reasonable pace. He clicked on his work flashlight. He pointed it at the gap between the emergency crate and the back wall. He said, in the most carefully neutral voice he had used in 6 years of professional neutrality, "I'm going to do inventory. It'll take about 10 minutes, and it requires counting everything on every shelf, including the area behind that crate. So if there is anyone back there who would prefer not to be inventoried, now would be a good time to mention it." The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. He counted them. Then Sally Solon said, very quietly, "Please don't tell anyone I'm here." She was sitting with her knees pulled to her chest in the gap behind the crate, wrapped in the spare thermal blanket he kept folded behind the pressure suit, which she had evidently located and appropriated at some point during the previous 72 hours with an efficiency that he found, despite everything, quietly impressive. Beside her were 2 flattened ration bar wrappers and a 3rd bar held against her chest with both hands, not eating it, just holding it, the way a person holds something when they have run out of better options and have decided that this particular thing is theirs. She looked up at him with her double irises, lighter than her mother's, the gold ring wider and more dominant, the violet outer ring very dark, and her expression was the precise mixture of relief and terror that belongs exclusively to people who have been found before they were ready to be found, and are still deciding whether this is better or worse than not being found at all. Cal looked at her. He looked at the 2 empty wrappers. He looked at the thermal blanket which he had purchased during a cold snap 4 years ago and which had cost him 11 credits, and which currently had a small child sitting inside it in his storage closet. "Those ration bars," he said, "taste like someone compressed a disappointing meal into a rectangle and then apologized to it. I want you to know that before you decide whether this situation has been worth it." Sally stared at him. "They do taste like that," she said, after a moment, with the gravity of a person confirming a long-held suspicion. "I know." He moved the crate aside and sat down on it, because standing over a child who was sitting on the floor of his storage closet felt like the wrong geometry for the conversation. The flashlight was still in his hand, and he angled it toward the shelf instead of at her face, which seemed like basic courtesy. "Tell me what's going on," he said. She told him. It came out in the particular way children tell things when they have been alone with them for too long. Not all at once, not in order, but in layers, the way geological strata come up when you dig, each one revealing the pressure that had compacted the one beneath it. The bonding ceremony was tomorrow. The Varon family. The boy named Dale, who had spent the entire diplomatic reception talking to a wall display about mineral extraction on the second moon of the Ithori home system, which she wanted to be clear, was not necessarily a permanent character assessment, but which had not suggested a strong basis for biological partnership. The registry. The word permanent, which she delivered not dramatically but with the flat exhaustion of someone who had been carrying it for weeks and had worn it smooth. The translation node clipped to his jacket pocket processed the Ithori terminology with its usual 2-beat lag, and then produced the word bonding, with two distinct layers of meaning sitting on top of each other like sediment, and Cal felt both of them. He asked her to explain the second layer, carefully, and she did, with the precise vocabulary of a child who had clearly researched what was being done to her, and had found the research deeply unhelpful. The genetic compatibility protocol was an Ithori practice that predated the integration treaties by several centuries. Pairs were established in early childhood to allow biological resonance to develop gradually rather than being forced in adulthood, which her people considered cruel and her people's medical literature considered significantly less stable. It was, she said, not a marriage. She had been told this clearly. It was a pre-bond, a compatibility registration, the first formal step in what her culture considered a responsible long-term process, and it had been arranged by her mother and the Varon family through the embassy's family affairs office, and it was filed, and it was tomorrow, and the boy had talked about moon minerals for 40 minutes without once asking her name. Cal looked at the ceiling for a moment. Did he at least know interesting things about the moon minerals? He said. Sally considered this with genuine fairness. He knew a lot of things about them, she said. He said the extraction yield in the third geological layer was significantly higher than the surface surveys had projected. She paused. I don't know what that means. Neither do I, Cal said, but it sounds like something a person would say if they were nervous. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read, partly because he was still learning to interpret double-iris expressions, and partly because it was the expression of a 7-year-old doing something very adult, which was considering an alternative explanation for something she had already decided about, and finding it unwelcome, but not entirely dismissible. He let her sit with that for a moment. Then he said, "How did you get into my quarters?" "Your door was unlocked," she said, without any particular guilt, in the tone of someone reporting a fact rather than confessing an action. "The second night of the quiet week. You left for a late shift and you didn't pull the door to the magnetic seal." "I do that sometimes," he admitted. "I know," she said. "I've noticed." He thought about the implications of a 7-year-old in a diplomatic residence who had been quietly conducting field observations on his door-locking habits, and he decided this was not the most pressing issue currently before him. He picked up his inventory form. He folded it. He put it in his chest pocket and zipped the pocket closed, which felt like the right physical punctuation for what he was about to say. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "I'm going to go upstairs. I'm going to walk into the room where your mother has been running a 17-person search operation for 3 days on no sleep, and I'm going to tell her you're safe. And then I'm going to say some things that are going to make that room very uncomfortable, including for me, because I don't particularly enjoy making rooms uncomfortable. It is genuinely not my preference." He stood up. "But before I do that," he said, "is there anything in this closet you'd like me to leave exactly where it is?" Sally looked around the storage space with the expression of someone taking stock of their circumstances honestly. "The blanket," she said. "The blanket stays," he said. 10 minutes, don't eat anything else." The seventh-floor common room had become, over 3 days, something that no longer resembled a common room in any meaningful sense. The couches had been pushed to the walls and were being used as surfaces for equipment rather than for sitting, and the table in the center held 17 empty cups in 2 distinct cultural styles, which Cal had noticed on every pass and which now struck him as the most honest document of the past 72 hours. All that effort, all that sleeplessness, all that desperate coordinated searching, distilled into a collection of cooling cups that nobody had cleared away, because nobody had had a spare moment to notice they were empty. The portable screen still showed 6 external camera feeds and the transit grid of the surrounding district. The map still had its pins. Someone had added 3 more since yesterday, pushing the search radius out to the transit hub 4 blocks east, which meant the search had been moving steadily away from the answer for 3 days in a row, which was the kind of operational irony that Cal did not feel was his place to comment on but which he noted. Ambassador Solon was standing at the center of it all with the communicator in both hands, speaking in low Ithori to one of the consulate security officers, and the bioluminescent lines on her forearms were burning the same steady, exhausted white he had seen the previous afternoon, the color of a system running on reserves it had not budgeted for. She did not see him in the doorway immediately. He stood there for a moment, which he used to confirm that he still intended to do what he had come up here to do, and then he said, clearly enough to carry across the room, "She's safe." The room stopped, not gradually, not person by person, but all at once the way a held breath stops. Ambassador Solon turned. The lines on her forearms blazed white, then cut completely dark, then came back at a frequency he had never seen, rapid, uneven, cycling through something that had no diplomatic composure in it. That was entirely and only a mother's nervous system trying to process a piece of information it had been preparing for, and was still not prepared for. She crossed the room in 4 steps. She stopped in front of him. Up close, her double irises were very still, the gold ring and the violet, both fixed on him with an intensity that had no professional distance in it at all. "Where?" she said. "3rd floor, my quarters, storage closet." He let a half-second pass because the next part needed its own space. "She's been there since day 1. Somewhere behind him, in the corridor, one of the integration office liaisons said something under her breath that the wall-mounted translation node rendered, with what Cal felt was a certain poetic aptness, as "the soup of obligation has grown cold." He didn't look back. He kept his eyes on the ambassador, who had closed hers for a moment, and whose forearm cycled through one more round of that rapid, unsteady light before settling into something low and very quiet. He asked the room to clear. He did it politely, in the tone he used when he needed access to a corridor for maintenance, and was technically within his rights to simply ask but preferred to phrase it as a courtesy, and the room cleared with the shuffling, cooperative energy of people who were tired enough to welcome being told what to do. Ferris, the building manager, left with a speed that suggested he had been waiting for permission since approximately hour 6 of the search. The security officers filed out with more dignity. The woman with the atmospheric scanner, who had been packing her equipment in the corner, gave Cal a look of professional evaluation on her way out that he chose to interpret as collegial. The liaison from the integration office was last. She paused beside him and said quietly, "You should have come to us sooner." He thought about this for a moment and said, "Nobody asked me," and she opened her mouth and then closed it and left, which he considered a fair outcome for everyone. Then it was just the two of them, and the 17 empty cups, and the map with too many pins. He told her. He said it the way he fixed things, without drama, without softening the structure of the problem, but without cruelty either, because cruelty had never once made a broken system work better. He told her that Sally was unhurt and had been sheltered, and had been eating his emergency rations, which he described accurately so that the ambassador would know the full measure of her daughter's commitment to the plan. He told her about the bonding ceremony, and Dale, and the moon minerals, and the word permanent spoken by a 7-year-old in the dark. He told her that Sally had crossed 12 meters of hallway and hidden in a storage closet for 72 hours rather than come home, and that this was the fact that required understanding before anything else could be resolved, because a child who runs 12 meters is not running from a building. She is running from something inside it, and the distance of the run tells you how large that something felt to her. Ambassador Solon listened to all of it. She was very still. The lines on her forearm stayed low and quiet, that color he still didn't have a name for, the one that lived at the border between recognition and something older and heavier than recognition. When he finished, she looked at the table, at the cups, at the map with its radius of pins pushing outward from an answer that had been 3 floors below the search the entire time. I told her it was tradition, she said, not defensively. Just factually, in the way a person states something they have already begun to understand differently. I know, Cal said. She told me. I told her it was stability. A pause. I told her it was what was best. She told me that too, he said. She listened to all of it. She's a good listener. He looked at the map. She just disagreed. Something shifted in the ambassador's posture. Not collapse, not surrender, but the specific internal adjustment of a person who has been carrying a position and has just, quietly, set it down to look at it from the outside for the first time. Her forearms dimmed further, to barely a glow, and for a moment she looked less like an ambassador and more like a parent standing in a room full of evidence that the distance between her and her child had been measured not in transit grids and camera feeds, but in something much harder to scan for. The Varon family, she said slowly, will need to be contacted. That seems like a conversation for tomorrow, Cal said. The registry filing. Also tomorrow. She looked at him. The gold irises shifted. You have a strong opinion about the scheduling, she said. And there was something in it that was not quite humor but was related to humor. That was the distant cousin of humor arriving in a difficult moment to indicate that the person was still intact. I have an opinion, he said, that your daughter has been sitting in a storage closet for 3 days, and she would probably like to see her mother before she sees a legal calendar. The ambassador held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she picked up the communicator from the table, looked at it once, and set it back down beside the empty cups, all 17 of them, human and Ithari, cooling together. Take me to her, she said. They rode the elevator down in silence, which was their established mode, except that this silence was different from every previous silence they had shared in that small moving box. Heavier, more inhabited, containing things that had no translation node adequate to them. When the doors opened on the 3rd floor and they walked down the corridor toward his quarters, Cal noticed that the bioluminescent lines on the ambassador's forearms had shifted to a color he had not seen from her before. A warm amber that moved steadily and without urgency, and he thought that whatever the Ithari lineage markings were calibrated to express, that particular color looked something like the word home must feel when you are almost there. He opened his door. He stepped aside. Ambassador Solon walked through his kitchen unit and past his narrow bed and to the storage closet at the back of the room, which was slightly open, and from which the edge of a thermal blanket was just visible, and she said her daughter's name once softly in Ithari, without waiting for the translation node, and no translation was needed. Cal went to put the kettle on. It seemed like the right thing to do, And it was, in the end, the kind of work he was good at, not the large diplomatic work, not the work of treaties and registries and bonding protocols, but the smaller and more fundamental work of making sure that, when something difficult happened, the room it happened in was as livable as he could make it. He filled the kettle. He listened to the quiet conversation coming from the back of his quarters, two voices in a language he mostly didn't understand. And he thought that 6 years of invisibility had turned out to have a shape he hadn't expected, not the shape of a man who didn't matter, but the shape of a man who had been in exactly the right place, on exactly the right floor, with exactly the right storage closet, at exactly the right time. The kettle boiled. He made 2 cups, one human style, one Ithori concentrate from the single cylinder he kept in the cabinet for no reason he had ever clearly articulated to himself. And he set them on the table and sat down and waited, in the particular patient silence of a man who has fixed the thing that needed fixing, and is content to let the room do the rest.